Welcome back. For our next session, we are really fortunate to have the pairing of Professor C. Riley Snorton and Professor Christina Hanhardt in this next hour and a half or so. I will introduce them, and they will speak in the order in which I introduced them. Christina Hanhardt is an associate professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the author of Safe Space, Gay Neighborhood History and the Politics of Violence, which won the 2014 Lambda Literary Award for Best Book in LGBT Studies. She has also published writing in Radical History Review, GLQ, Women in Performance, the Journal of American History, and the book Policing the Planet, among others. She's now at work on two projects: Left Out, which engages debates in queer theory and politics to track the history of stigma in left social movements more broadly, and This Is Not a Safe Space, which looks at debates about safety and belonging on U.S. college campuses today. Our next speaker on this panel is Professor C. Riley Snorton, who is professor in English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago. Professor Snorton is a cultural theorist who analyzes representations of race, gender, and sexuality. He is the author of Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2017, which won the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction, the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies Sylvia Rivera Award for Transgender Studies, the John Boswell Prize for LGBTQ History from the American Historical Association, and the William Sanders Scarborough Prize for African American Literature and Culture from the Modern Language Association. Professor Snorton is also the author of Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, also published with the University of Minnesota Press, and has co-edited several special issues of journals such as Transgender Studies Quarterly, Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, and the International Journal of Communication. He has been the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and a Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellowship at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research. So we will hear first from Professor Hanhardt, who will announce the title of her reflections.
Yes, I did have a title at one point, and now I seem to have forgotten my title. But it's a title. I will say the title was a riff on reframing transgender violence on issues of historical methods and questions, and that will appear clearly. So I want to start by saying thank you so much to Kendall for the invitation to be here today, and to Catherine and Megan and Aya for making all of the details possible. So the theme of the symposium is can everyone hear me? Am I speaking properly into this? Okay. So the theme of this symposium is reframing transgender violence. And today my brief comments will focus on how we might reframe the history of anti-transgender violence. Is it on? How we might reframe the history of anti-transgender violence, or more specifically, the history of social movements to combat anti-transgender violence. To do so, I want to think a little bit about how this history is framed, on the one side, by the emergence and transformation of the so-called LGBT anti-violence movement, which has been my own research focus, and on the other, by the history of the feminist anti-violence movement. It's not giving anything away to say in advance that violence against transgender people is often ignored or minimized in both contexts, and we've heard a lot about that thus far at this symposium. But today I want to explore why that has been the case and what might be both afforded but also lost by an approach of greater inclusion. To do so, I'm going to take the invitation of the organizers to return to some of the research I did for my book, Safe Space, in order to pull out more specifically where trans experience and politics figures in that history. From there, I'll consider some disciplinary and methodological challenges and opportunities for better understanding the history of activism against anti-transgender violence and how that might help us approach the issue in our contemporary moment as well. So my book, Safe Space, Gay Neighborhood History and the Politics of Violence, was titled to reflect what emerged as its focus, a history of gay political organizing against violence framed in the context of debates about neighborhood. Its emphasis on gay men and secondarily lesbians who were, or more often who were not, also transgender identified, is a feature of the national anti-violence movement, which did not until the mid to late 1990s systematically center the problem of anti-transgender violence specifically. And although activism against anti-LGBT violence is varied, the so-called LGBT anti-violence movement is most associated with a set of initiatives linked to the founding of the Anti-Violence Project by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, now the National LGBTQ Task Force, in the early 1980s. And its emphasis has long been the collection of data about violence, so the kinds of examples that we heard earlier today in the context of Brazil, while advocating for both local and federal hate crime statutes that we also heard about earlier. Radical activists and scholars, with whom many of us in the room are familiar, and many people are themselves, have discussed the limits of a focus on hate crimes, arguing that strategies based on heightened criminal penalties do little to put forward a project of justice. In this context, arguments about the exclusion of transgender people have focused on its symbolic power, joined by a critical take on criminal justice solutions. So this is similar, although absolutely not parallel, to these debates about the exclusion of transgender people in the military. Okay, so they're not parallel, but it's a similar question of vexed inclusion. These critiques have been essential to efforts to pursue solutions to anti-LGBT violence in community-based, often restorative or transformative justice models, and has often, in those contexts, met up with radical feminist activism as well. Here I want to highlight two things for our discussion. First, that the national LGBT anti-violence movement has not only invested primarily in legal versus anti-carceral solutions, but that it has not had as tight a relationship to the national legal reform feminist anti-violence movement, as have these grassroots forms of queer and feminist organizing. And second, that the other major goal of national movements, to count rates of violence, has not been a major object of critique, in part because organizations have expanded their categories of injury and of vulnerable subjects. Understanding the longer genealogy of the national LGBT anti-violence movement demonstrates, though, that the inclusion of transgender people into both national and grassroots organizing represents not only a vexed incorporation into a project of state punishment, on the one hand, or, on the other hand, a radical remediation of state solutions, but it also risks, in both contexts of national legal reform movements and grassroots movements, manifesting a vexed incorporation or remediation of varied models of sex, gender, minority identity into narrow terms of legibility, which in turn has assumed certain social movement partners and not others, and has limited forms of trans leadership. So as a quick rundown, it's important to emphasize that the origin of the formal LGBT anti-violence movement can be found squarely in debates about the development and protection of urban space. This is not because rural places were wholly omitted from activism, but the national anti-violence movement was initially anchored in safe streets patrols in newly gentrifying neighborhoods in the 1970s. These patrols were, in fact, not only the very first formal efforts to combat individual anti-gay violence, there were informal efforts before that, but they were also in contradiction to varied forms of activism that preceded them. Indeed, throughout the 1960s, including in the years prior to Stonewall, gay, lesbian, and trans activists more often organized against poverty and policing than street or individual violence. And their debates tended to be over whether to demand the redistribution of resources through community-based initiatives like those associated with war and poverty programs, versus refusing any terms of state participation. And despite the very popular attention that many of you may be familiar with of the conservative gender politics of the homophile movement that often did demand for public protests that people appear in gender-conforming dress, trans people were essential participants in both liberal anti-poverty mobilizations and more radical refusals during this time. For example, in San Francisco in the mid-1960s, street youth associated with the organization Vanguard, some of them trans, collaborated and found conflict with the liberal Mattachine Society in their shared fight for what they dubbed at the time a gay or homosexual politics of neighborhood. And some of you might be familiar with pieces of this from Susan Stryker's film on the riot at Compton's cafeteria. Part of what united these different groups was that the street life of homosexuality at that time more often than not overlapped with other stigmatized practices in the so-called Skid Row neighborhoods in which these campaigns focused. These different groups also both tended to agree with, even as they debated the details, that certain practices, not identities, like cruising, sex work, drug use, or even forms of gender nonconformity, were in fact symptoms of social rejection that called for services and care rather than punishment. The development of gay neighborhoods in the 1970s, aided by the restructuring of an economy that newly facilitated opportunities for middle-class people outside of the normative family structure, relocated much gay street life from Skid Rows to new gay neighborhoods, and in the process aligned with the political and social goals of a majority white back to the city middle class, rather than the unregulated street life of the racialized poor. Thus, 1960s community participation models were retooled into community-based police practices in some neighborhoods, and social service delivery in others, as the category of anti-gay violence moved into the criminological in the context of gay neighborhoods. While non-normative gender remained more associated with the stigmatized so-called lifestyles of the poor. Thus, a key activist argument of a new gay movement, that lesbian and gay people were neither criminal nor sick and were in fact vulnerable to harm, worked to disaggregate normative categorizations of lesbian and gay identity from a broad matrix of so-called social deviances often associated with racialized poverty in the city, and dubbed urban disorder or culture of poverty are two of the most common forms. And this marked what would continue to be both a conceptual and a spatial distance between lesbian and gay politics and others, including trans politics, at dominant culture's margins. The long-term implications of this have been many, but there's a few that I want to note here. The first is that the founding of the lesbian and gay anti-violence movement out of anti-crime strategies led to an identity and a set of social movement partnerships that did not simply exclude transgender people, but left many of them wholly illegible. In fact, the two biggest partners of the early lesbian and gay anti-violence movement were the Crime Victims' Rights Movement, which was founded at the very same time, and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. That was the major leader in fighting for federal hate crime laws addressing religious hate. And we can discuss the politics of the ADL perhaps in the Q&A. That's a whole other discussion. The basis of the first alliance was that anti-gay violence was first and foremost a crime, and the latter, that sexual identity, like religious identity, is supposedly not visible on the body, and manifested instead in the built environment and representative spaces, such as gay community centers or places of worship. Thus, transgender people, whose street life was often associated with spaces of crime, whose identity was considered by many to be legible on the body, and was not associated with a formal built environment, all fell outside this frame. So to provide a precise example, a memo that was sent from the Gay and Lesbian Community Action Council of Minneapolis to the Anti-Violence Project of the NGLTF in 1991 read as follows. Quote, I have several cases where the victim was of color. The most striking involved transvestite/transsexual black men, women. These cases involved police abuse. And it appears that our fine police force is often out looking for people they believe are hookers, and these folks get picked up a lot. One case involves a black transsexual who wanted to visit her boyfriend in prison and was given the runaround and restricted quite severely. This particular case is well known and probably not appropriate for your report on anti-gay violence. End quote. So there are many reasons to believe that the NGLTF might in fact have been interested in this case, okay? But the note reveals that for how so many experiences of trans people were not able to be accounted for in the terms of the anti-violence movement, even as during these very same years of the 1990s, some trans-identified individuals were becoming more active in the NGLTF and even developing transgender-specific campaigns. So in this case, it is not only because the women invoked in general terms in the memo have been targeted by the police rather than summoned to police protection that they've been excluded, but it's also because the implication is that police have picked them up for sex work, or in the case of the specific woman the memo cites towards its end, that her lack of access to her incarcerated partner is what has heightened her vulnerability. Here we see not only the problem of the carceral investments of hate crimes, which many of us share and have discussed, but also the limits of reporting and recognition that understand one's status as a victim in the terms of a protected identity that has been produced in opposition to the very conditions that have arguably produced these own women's vulnerability, urban disorder, as both the threat and the conditions of, as a threat to normative LGBT identity, and as the conditions of these women's own vulnerability. Moreover, insofar as these conditions are structured specifically of race, class, and gender, this move simultaneously leaves many gender nonconforming people of color as illegible, at the very same time that it also offers a model of inclusion for some people within that very same category as well. In addition, the gap between the LGBT anti-violence movement and the feminist anti-violence movement must be seen as not only due to these neighborhood politics-based origins, but also to the increased separation of sexuality and gender as categories of identification during this time. A move that was made in many contexts to at once facilitate the recognition of a certain model of transgender identity, but that also worked to exclude those for whom a different sex-gender system was operative and to isolate discussions of misogyny in cases of violence against trans women, which Kendall pointed to yesterday in your opening comments. These contradictions, in which the promise of inclusion also comes with the exclusion produced by illegibility, is an issue that I gestured at but did not well develop in my book, Safe Space. But now this provides the grounds of some of my new research that I'm just going to talk a little bit about and then wrap up. So the last chapter of Safe Space looks at debates about safety in the early 2000s in Greenwich Village, when residents, many white and some LGBT and or T, invoked gay safe streets activism in order to protect themselves from what they considered to be the undesirable street activities of queer and trans people of color who socialize in the neighborhood. To do so, they used one of the primary tools to come out of Great Society era progressive reform in New York, community boards, in combination with new policing strategies, namely quality of life laws. The chapter highlights the activities of Fierce, a queer youth of color organization with which many of us here are familiar. Yes. I look at some of the strategies that Fierce successfully adopted in order to have a voice in the neighborhood. But as I noted in nearly the very last paragraph of the book, it remained to be seen in the years since if Fierce's successes, which at that time included a possible youth center, would actually be able to include the many people who hang out in the area and are targeted because of the fact of their, the virtue of their status, say as adults rather than youth, their practice, such as sex work or drug use, identities that might not fit into legible service models, or most importantly, desires, maybe not to abide by the terms of a community center in which sex and drugs could not be traded inside. And whether or not this then would leave actually the vast majority of people targeted in Greenwich Village outside of Fierce's utopian vision, especially because during those years at the very end of the book, the membership and leadership of Fierce had changed to include an increasing number of people who did not have any history or connection with the neighborhood. I didn't answer that question, in part because I've been working on that book really way too long, but also because the project had focused on a kind of public political debate that made its way into the public sphere. And this was one of many, in particular the political contestations of adult trans women who hang out in the neighborhood that did not have a voice in the public sphere. And I, for various reasons that we can also talk about methodologically in the Q&A, chose against the kind of ethnographic approach that might have given me better access to these worlds. The limit of the book, though, has inspired my new research, which looks at the political organization of those left out of this history, of the normative consolidation of the LGBT movement. It is, in many ways, then, Safe Space's shadow history of people pushed into the shadows of mainstream LGBT politics, but also more specifically of shadow economies, such as those of sex and drugs, and the shadow state, Jennifer Wolch's term for the service-providing volunteer sector that, over the past 40 years, has assumed a crucial role in the context of state retrenchment. So while Safe Space asks after the legacy of Keynesian-inflected social programs, Left Out is interested in the transformation of the terms of self-determination into do-it-yourself alternatives. Indeed, the distinction between the post-war and the neoliberal era is not as stark as many suggest, and many of the liberal politics from the 1960s actually laid the groundwork for the transformation that we've seen, with its focus on self-help and a popular uptake of social psychology, cast in terms of the ideals of self-care and healthiness, that today can be indistinguishable from market-based solutions based in individual responsibility, risk management, and the economic values of autonomy. Left Out is also a history of those who fall outside, often defiantly, the dominant structures of both minority identity and economic class that have anchored left social movement and urban history. I use the metaphor here of the street to trace then instead anti-poverty and welfare politics, religious missions, drug user unions, HIV/AIDS activism, including the history of harm reduction and needle exchange programs, sex worker mobilizations, and prisoner solidarity projects. In particular, it focuses on the intersection of racial and sexual stigma through the regulation of pleasure and off-the-books economic activity. Looking, for example, for understanding a history of anti-transgender violence in, for instance, the attack on Black women's labor through the federal defunding of the anti-poverty organization ACORN, or at the emerging focus on trans women of color in a new generation of radical identified queer political organizing. Indeed, at the center of this project is understanding the genealogy of this heightened rhetorical focus on the vulnerability of low-income trans women of color that has still, though nonetheless, not engaged with the broad matrix of vulnerabilities that very identity might suggest. I'm interested then in how this figure and how this often abstracted figure becomes a focus, and what other social movement histories we might follow in order to understand that. So this involves a few themes I'm going to name, and then I'm going to stop talking because I wrote more than I thought I had. Sorry. First, how have informal economies functioned as sites of gendered and racialized labor, violence, and political organizing? So here I'm thinking about the work of people like Swati Shah, whose book Street Corner Secrets looks at women in Mumbai who do sex work as but one of multiple forms of precarious labor in that city's informal economy, and doesn't privilege the fact of sex, but the fact of informality as they move in and out of also the building trades. Second, what happened to the politics of health in the context of neoliberalism's call for a cultivation of the self? Here I'm thinking again about how ideals of self-care and self-possession can function as mandates in subcultures that are cast as alternatives to state programs. How, for example, have abolitionists who address issues of incarceration, for example, engage those who don't abide by the broader ideals of either self or communitarian care? I'm also interested in the transformation of political strategies of solidarity and experience in the context of the, we may all agree, I hope, dead debate between identity and class structure. What forms of identity are seen to suture people to those for whom they advocate, and what happens when there is a gap in experience, if not in identity? In Safe Space, I was surprised to find in the 1980s a multiracial, anti-racist, it's a long description, multiracial, anti-racist, non-explicitly trans-identified lesbian feminist group. It's among the few who advocated for women of color, trans-identified and not, who worked the very varied roles we might remember from the late 70s and early 80s all along the west side of Manhattan. As well as those who were targeted by heightened policing during those years in Times Square, such as the police attack on Blues Bar, a black gay and trans bar. Their affinities were often cast in the terms of their anti-racism. So while it would be short-sighted to argue that these lesbian feminists had to develop trans politics, they didn't. A close look at the range of movements that I've named, be it needle exchange programs, community health collectives, prison abolition projects, provide a deep history for models of political solidarity that do not necessarily involve a specific invocation of shared identity. And finally, to do this research involves then a very different kind of historical study, one that does not take the terms of not only LGBT social movements, but also its historiography as its starting point, and often pursues instead these genealogies, which is a historically undisciplined method, to understand the emergence of these ideas. And the only way to do that is then to look to more speculative and cultural forms of understanding the construction of identity in the past, in work by people like Sarah Haley, and let this be my introduction to the brilliant Riley Snorton. Thank you very much.
I was actually just going to say, Christina, how much my excitement for this new project is through the roof every time I get to talk to you about it. I'm thrilled, and also I'm so grateful for the work in the safe space. Thank you so much, Kendall Thomas, for the invitation. Thank you to Catherine and Aya and Megan for coordination of logistics and also the kind of broader matrix of folks who make these things happen. I also didn't provide a title, but I tried to make one up. And so I think loosely I'd call this something like On the Matter of History and the Possibility of a Usable Past. Since the publication of my second book, I've been humbled to be in conversations around the themes of Black on both sides. And typically I've organized my talk around a chapter or two, framing some of the questions that animated the writing. But what I've prepared to do today is to talk about how history bears upon this particular moment, the politics of the leaked Department of Health and Human Services memo, the return of the trans military ban, the various anti-trans bills circulating at the state level, such as the birth certificate bill in Utah, the government shutdown and threats of calling a national emergency to build Trump's border wall, the ongoing crisis of human caging in prisons and detention centers, the myriad forms of anti-Black violence that structure our American grammar in relation to some of the things I learned while writing this book. So at this point, it may be a far memory, but on October 21st, 2018, the New York Times published an article under the headline, "Transgender could be defined out of existence under Trump administration." This leaked memo from the Department of Health and Human Services argued that key government agencies needed to adopt an explicit and uniform definition of gender as determined on a biological basis that is clear, grounded in science, objective, and administrable. The agency's proposed definition would define sex as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals that a person is born with. Any dispute about one's sex would have to be clarified using genetic testing. So according to the New York Times, the new definition would essentially eradicate federal recognition for the estimated 1.4 million Americans who've opted to recognize themselves, surgically or otherwise, as a gender other than the one they were born into. Within hours of the article's release, the hashtag "won't be erased" began to circulate on social media. By Monday, trans activists and their supporters protested and marched in Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, and in other cities across the U.S.
Would you speak into the mic a little bit more as a
Got it. Okay.
That's great.
Okay. So to be clear, this is after setting up the language, the New York Times' language around the leaked memo from the Department of Health and Human Services. I just wanted to kind of start with the grounds on which I will approach that as one moment among a constellation of many others that are both sets of policies, but also their kind of mediation and remediation in terms of thinking about the kind of landscapes of vulnerability, precarity that affect trans folks unevenly. Right? So to be clear, trans people existed before state recognition, and trans people live by avoiding state recognition. Trans people's survival has often been in spite of, or often in opposition to the state. This is the story of many Black trans people living now and in the past, like the figures I discussed in Chapter 4, who often emerge in the archive as a result of their violent encounters with the state. Take, for example, the story of Jim McHarris / Annie Lee Grant, who, while apparently ridiculed for living life restively, also made a life as a gender nonconforming, trans-masculine person in Mississippi in the 1950s. So in November of 1954, Ebony printed a 5-page feature replete with images of McHarris Grant under the headline, "The Woman Who Lived as a Man for 15 Years." The Ebony feature began by laying out the scene of McHarris Grant's capture. Quote, "Into the small bare office of the mayor of Coseco, Mississippi, a policeman walked with a husky prisoner. According to the article, the police agent told mayor and city court judge, T.D. Roan, quote, when I tried to search him, he protested and told me, take it easy, I'm a woman. Within the confines of the mayor's office, which also served as the courtroom, McHarris Grant went into a closet, emerging some moments later, having discarded a shirt, pants, and male underwear. Convicted, it is unclear from the article whether the charges were traffic or gender-related, and sentenced to 30 days in jail or a fine of $100, McHarris Grant left the courthouse with the intention of serving the time, and with editorial panache, Ebony represented for its audience how the domain of gender is, as Eric Stanley describes, one of the most volatile points of contact between state violence and a body. The interplace of race and gender here, in which a racially motivated form of police surveillance gave way to a gender-related court conviction, produced a tripartite formulation, as jail time was but one of McHarris Grant's modes of disciplining. Following Roan's decision, word of the sensational unmasking of Jim McHarris quickly got around Cusco, and according to the article, jarred the quiet small town. In addition to producing McHarris Grant's gender as spectacle, McHarris Grant was sent to the men's prison facility, in which McHarris Grant was treated as a woman. Sarah Haley's analysis of carceral gendering is instructive here, which, as she argues, reveals that gendered knowledge is produced not merely through male-female binaries, but through a complex of material and discursive knowledge projects in which normative female gendering was produced through the spectacular cultural and legal production of the black female invert. In this sense, one should understand how Mississippi's penal system was particularly equipped to make sense of McHarris Grant's gender according to a neither nor logic, which is to say McHarris Grant's legal assessment and carceral treatment was part of a longer history of gendered racial terror, knowledge, and discipline. The story of how Annie Lee Grant would become known as James McHarris, particularly because McHarris Grant was raised only 78 miles away in the town of Meridian, Mississippi, loomed as one of the major questions for the article to address, this Ebony article. But as a form of visual proof, Ebony included an image of McHarris Grant on the top of the second page of the feature in a moment of partial undress. And as textual evidence, the article explained that before taking residence in Cusco, McHarris Grant lived and worked in Memphis, Chicago, and other Midwestern cities, where, quote, she threw herself wholeheartedly into the male masquerade, seeking the hardest jobs, including as a cook, a taxi driver, a gas station attendant, and a preacher. So while McHarris Grant's movement from city to city is put forward as a context for McHarris Grant to practice and perfect life as a man, the movement itself is also explained as the outcome of McHarris Grant's, quote, talent for avoiding situations which would have revealed her true sex, in which McHarris Grant opted to quit jobs whenever medical examinations were scheduled. So in an anecdote meant to dramatize the distance between the figure's adolescent presentation and McHarris Grant's appearance as an adult, Ebony opined, but Annie Lee was still rested. The article's use of the phrase, presumably to disparage McHarris Grant's gender comportment, opens onto a schema for understanding how McHarris Grant's various movements and gendered ways of being were each negotiation points in what Hortense Spillers describes as a space for living. Restive's double meaning, which in one sense describes the adverse behavior of the discontented, an inability to remain still, silent, or submissive, and in another, characterize a person who is stubbornly refusing to advance, intractable, refractory, fixed in an opinion or course of action, both refer, whether by fixedness or movement, to a person intent on resisting control. The term double meaning also gives context for McHarris Grant's impermanent gender identifications, providing a more precise alternative to Passing's narration to suppose how a figure may inhabit various gender positions with a sense of sincerity and intransience until otherwise moved. As counter-political gestures, they form an alternative assemblage of evidence, not of teleological gender transformation, but of the possible positions one can occupy within contradictory, itinerant circuits of power. The feature's closing vignette staged the final exchange between McHarris Grant and the prison superintendent at the moment of McHarris Grant's release. Quote, bidding her goodbye, Superintendent Eakin advised, girl, you get your dress now, and the things a woman ought to do. In response, McCarra's Grant was quoted as simply saying, "I don't see it like that." Ebony's story, bookended by scenes of McCarra's Grant's capture and release, ultimately concluded in the way it began. Quote, "At 30, after a lifetime of heartbreaks and deception, Annie Lee made an incredible decision. She decided to remain a man, though exposed and publicized as a woman, determined to hold on to the strands of a way of life which makes her happy," end quote. In other words, McCarra's Grant remained restive, and that "I don't see it like that" then reflects an insistence on a future worth living, or what Kai Green and Trevor Ellison call transvesting, which is not only a collective action, but a worldview, a way of seeing, despite the ways we are being seen. So though trans people existed before state recognition, this latest slate of anti-trans, anti-black, and anti-brown federal and state policies intensify the relationship between transness and premature death for the most vulnerable in prisons, hospitals, detention centers, schools, and homeless shelters. As part of its ongoing coverage of the leaked memo, the Daily Podcast, a subsidiary of the New York Times, reported on the migrant caravan, including a brief story about 3 queer and trans Salvadorians walking among the many headed to the U.S. southern border. They were seeking asylum, and this was where Black on Both Sides began, with a news report about another asylum seeker. In 2015, while garnering publicity for the feature film drama and a live interview with Robin Roberts on Good Morning America, actress, artist, and advocate Laverne Cox expressed a public grief. Quote, "We in the transgender community right now are reeling. Just yesterday we found out another trans woman was murdered, Tamara Dominguez, and that makes a total of 17 known transgender women who have been murdered in 2015 alone. It really is a state of emergency. Your life should not be in danger simply for being who you are. We have to say these people's names. I think the reason why trans women experience so much violence has to do with employment, housing, healthcare, etc. So we need to make sure that trans lives matter." So Tamara Dominguez died on Monday, August 17, 2015, in a Missouri hospital after sustaining injuries from being struck repeatedly with a sports utility vehicle in a church parking lot in northeast Kansas City. According to her boyfriend, she had been living as a woman in the United States for at least 7 years after leaving her native Mexico to escape discrimination for being transgender. She had a lot of dreams, the unidentified boyfriend told the Kansas City Star, invoking a familiar mythology of the hopes, dreams, and promises of different experiential modes of freedom possible in the U.S. The framing of her death in such terms underscores the failed promise of a nation-state, as it also calls attention to what Enoch Page and Matt Richardson describe as a state technique of racialized gender that produces gender-variant social formations as an excluded caste. According to an article published on Advocate.com, under the headline Victim Number 17, Trans Woman of Color Murdered in Missouri, information regarding Dominguez's death came on the heels of news about 3 African-American trans women, Amber Monroe of Detroit, Michigan, Candace Capri of Phoenix, Arizona, and Alicia Walker of Smithville, North Carolina, who were reported murdered in just the past few days. The recurrent practice of enumerating the dead in mass and social media seems to conform to the logics of accumulation that structure racial capitalism, in which the quantified abstraction of Black and trans death reveals the calculated value of Black and trans lives through states' grammars of deficit and debt. As Catherine McKittrick explains about the long delay of slavery, this is where we begin. This is where historic Blackness comes from, the list, the breathless numbers, the absolutely economic, the mathematics of unliving. This mode of accounting, of expressing the arithmetic violence of Black and trans death, as it also refers to anti-Black, anti-queer, and anti-trans forms of slow and imminent death, find additional elaboration of what Dagmara Woodstead refers to as a poetics of compounded loss, which she defines as a mode of inventory taking, the reconceptualization of relentless serial losses, not as cumulative, but as compounding, with the subject's loss both object and subject, past and perspective, memory, and immediate threat. From this vantage point, consider how Cox's designation of a state of emergency to refer to the killing of trans women, most of whom are Black and brown, sharpens the distinction between the state's rhetorical use of that phrase, particularly as we talk about this national emergency to build a wall, and the real state of emergency that surfaces as a matter of history. As Walter Benjamin writes in his 8th tenet, on the thesis of in the philosophy of history, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. Benjamin continues, we must attain a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, which we might read along with what Homi Bhabha has written in his foreword to Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, that the state of emergency is also and always a state of emergence, in which the event of struggle challenges the historicist idea of time as a progressive ordered whole. As such, Cox's gesture toward the numerous structural factors and institutional practices of racialized gender that delimit Black and brown trans women's life chances expresses territories of violence, sites of vulnerability and precarity, and scenes of slow death, to which one might read into that, etc., the prison systems, asylums, and detention centers. These institutions and their emplacement within current biopolitical and necropolitical orders bear upon the problem of history as a mode of organizing time, according to anti-Black and anti-trans rule. They perpetuate racialized gender as a norm and as a necessary and naturalized consequence of the current order of things, the experience of which Kara Keeling describes as a spatio-temporal concern, as that intolerable yet quotidian violence that functions as the historical index of belonging to our time. Cox's comment, which emerges as an interruption in the flow of entertainment news to adhere within the disruptive temporality of mourning, is articulated within the persistent tense of the present, as another indication of this break with teleological time. Her articulation of loss on behalf of the transgender community intimates an understanding of what Frantz Fanon wrote in relation to the colonial state of emergency that produces Black alienation, you might also say Black grief, as more than mere individual concern. And into that political and epistemological poria famously expressed that beside phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny. As Keeling explains, Fanon's own interest is in exploding the temporality of the colonial mode of representation of otherness and revealing a temporality that raises the possibility of impossibility within colonial rule of Black liberation. So the sliding index of Cox's we seems also to gesture toward the temporality of sociogenesis, in the form of a plea for a different future to begin now. The named we of the transgender community that opens Cox's expression feels different from the undesignated we in the concluding flourish, which invents an intersubjective community called forth by the urgency of trans life matters, in which one can hear as an echo from the future, but Kathy Cohen carefully elaborated in a question about the radical potential of a queer politic based on a careful analysis of power. It is in this sense that Cox's final rhetorical flourish, we need to make sure that trans lives matter, which indexes without citation the movement for Black lives, does not sound wholly appropriative, and becomes an opportunity to hear that there is no absolute distinction between Black lives mattering and trans lives mattering within the rubrics of racialized gender. And there is no necessary distinction between the beginning and the ending of Black on both sides, particularly in response to our current moment, in which trans people, undocumented Black, brown, and indigenous folks still insist on their lives mattering. The iconic Black trans activist, Miss Major, whose image and quote in this recent moment has become a meme, characterized with a drawing of Miss Major sitting on a couch and a cool quote from her that simply says, "I'm still fucking here." In relation to news of the leaked memo from San Francisco, California, so recently, she moved from San Francisco, California to Little Rock, Arkansas, because as she said on the heels of this most recent presidential election, while they're blessing and inaugurating Trump, I'm going to be inaugurating my girls. In another moment in the interview, she explains why they moved to Arkansas. Quote, because the girls in the South are suffering more than the girls are on the coast. New York is fighting really hard and they're together. San Francisco is together. LA is working on it. San Diego is pulling up the ranks. But the girls in the South, they are just struggling so bad. And behind this, I figure I should go there and use what notoriety I have with this documentary, referring to Miss Major, the documentary, to get something going there for them so they can realize that they are just as worthwhile as everybody else. And they don't have to leave their home and where they're comfortable and move to some big city. Because a lot of people aren't city folks. A lot of folks aren't city folks. And we can't imagine that cities provide full protection. In terms of suffering, though, Ms. Major might be referring to the horizons of premature death that shape trans life in small towns and cities in the South and across the country. And even so, there is still life, a term I use to describe the interface of survival as that film of life that exceeds life's meaning and posthumous life, wherein Black and trans life continue to accrue meaning even after the event of death. And so I'll end with a supposition. Suppose that Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter are not present tense or presentist formulations. Rather, as rhetorical enactments, they evince a different conception of history and therefore necessarily a different rubric of valuation. Recalling how, as Edward Glissant explained, history is destined to be pleasure or distress on its own terms. Glissant's emphasis on history's own terms elicits an engagement with the sociogenic principle as a concept through which to explore the temporal register of BLM, TLM, BTLM. In the future imperfect, which is to say, in that commingling of temporalities where the past is brought forth to the future to give rise to the present, Black Trans Lives Matter, which provides a conceptual framework to understand the ongoing struggle in the present by way of a future, perhaps aspiration, in which Black trans and Black trans lives will have mattered to everyone. For some, including those following Fanon, that future effectively means the end of the world, and perhaps Black and trans lives mattering in this way would end the world. But worlds end all the time. Sun Ra and his intergalactic research orchestra already told us it's after the end of the world. And even so, and as yet, there is still life.
All right, so we have a good amount of time for reactions, questions, comments, and the like. This is wonderful, not least because what I described, Riley, you weren't here yesterday. I said that this space inhabits something between a workshop and a conference, that it resists the practice which has become fashionable in universities of heavily curated conferences, which take through their scripting of conversations an approach that doesn't leave any space for encounters that can't be predicted in advance or unexpected, and open up possibilities. This is turned into, although this wasn't my thinking originally, into a really fruitful discussion, I think, on an issue that we really haven't specifically raised in these terms over the course of the last couple of days, but which I think was embedded in the conversation we had this morning with our lawyer activist friends, which was in many ways a question about lawyering practice and legal method, a harm reduction approach taken from public health as a model for a law practice aimed at recognizing that you're seeking to change through law the conditions that render trans people vulnerable to violence, even as you realize that the law is a technology of violence, right? So that conversation about method, I think, really set up nicely what has turned into a discussion about what might be called critical trans methods, historical, hermeneutic / interpretive, and otherwise. So I thought I might, before we open up the questions to the floor, give the two of you 5-7 minutes to engage with one another, specifically around the ways in which you see the space between your projects as addressing urgent questions of trans critical method in thinking about the problem, if that's the right term, or the politics of violence against trans people. Not least because both of you are really quite insistent, unapologetically so, on the importance methodologically of connecting transcritical analysis to a broader field that is not identitarian, but which recognizes the ways in which practices of identification, de-identification, and the like do matter, not just conceptually, but for practical political purposes in forming, for example, social and political movements. So, Christina, Riley, thoughts at the empty space between you?
I could throw out a few sort of questions or comments here, and then I'm eager to hear. Oh, sorry. I'm eager to hear what the audience also has to say here. But there's a few notes that I think that I saw a very sort of tight resonance in our comments today, and in our work otherwise, and I think are good to put on the table also in the context of yesterday and this morning's conversation, which was your precise use of the word unevenness. And I think that's I think it's often very hard to talk about unevenness in a way that it's also hard to talk about contradiction. There's often a desire for good players and bad players, for resolution, for those that are on the side of marginality and those who have power, those who occupy norms and those who resist them. And I think unevenness is a framework that is a helpful way of thinking about power. I also really appreciated your notes about Catherine Cohen's approach then to historicizing queerness as both as neither wholly identitarian nor non-identitarian, but about tracing the production of power. And that's one of the tools that we have to be able to get at this production of unevenness, and to look at the ways in which our sets of knowledge are made within our academic disciplines, within our social movement practices, in constructing the very categories that we seek to trace or represent. And then the last little note that I'll throw out to you that was is I really loved the ways in which you talked about this pairing of intractability and itineracy. And I do think that that's a really big aspect of this history about subjects who are, rather than, let's say, fixed or moored in place, are both moving, but also considered intractable. So their own sort of set of defiant refusals. And so those are three things I'll throw out to you, but I'd love to hear more.
Thanks. And just to pick up on that last piece, I mean, I think that there is something that we could discuss in greater length around what that dynamic means in producing something or naming something a trans archive. It's a kind of methodological acknowledgement, but I think it's also about a kind of honoring, or at least providing another interpretive framework for thinking about figures who are interred into these archives as intractable and itinerant because of some pathology, rather than in thinking about what are the kind of broader structural factors that would make one need to be still or to move quickly. And I really appreciate the ways that you in the first and also in this forthcoming work are laying out elegantly what kinds of structural factors make make producing a kind of project like Left Out both possible, but also to kind of stand within limits. And I'm particularly interested in talking more here and hopefully ongoingly about these kind of politics of solidarity, and particularly, on what terms are those solidarities named. So when you were discussing fierce, and maybe this is a provocation that we can't quite encounter at this moment, but I was thinking a lot about how fierce had a long line of trans men of color who were at the helm of that organization, who were some of them not from New York, but I was also just thinking about what is how are we thinking about trans of color leadership in such a way that I think it kind of gets to, and I don't want to misread what you were saying or mishear what you were saying, but I think that there was something that you were pointing us to that says that's like there's an emphasis on thinking about the possibilities for trans women of color that actually obscures thinking about their vulnerabilities in precise ways. And I think some of that also has to do with certain forms of thinking about them as separable from other modes of trans embodiment. And I think that affects a whole host of different things. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I was
like those words.
Right. But I think that in some ways, like when we only can think about trans violence as murder, then we also begin to have a much less. We lose our abilities to really think through the textures of trans violence that affect trans and non-trans people, but also that are unevenly affecting, trans women, gender non-binary folks, trans men. That there's actually, whether we call this gender ideology or cult of domesticity, heterosexual contract. I mean, we've got that all of these kinds of structures and ways of knowing produce forms of vulnerability for transness that get flattened by an understanding of trans violence as discernible by way of a kind of switch of life or death. That we actually, I think, it's incumbent for us to also think about relations to other modes of living, whether we use language of like living socially dead, or we talk about slow death, or we talk about a whole host of other ways of thinking through the impossibilities of trans lives. Anyway.
Bingo. So we're actually back, Osley, at the first panel, right? On this question of violence as relation. Everything has come together. So Mariana Hirsch is going to lead us off with the question.
Thank you. It's been a remarkable 2 days already, and by this morning I was thinking, how can we reframe this when we're just so immersed in rhetorical, discursive violence and material violence and just lists of murders and sorrow and tragedy. So I wanted to bring back the idea of reframing and maybe situate it in the temporalities that you both used to talk about this, because you're talking in very different time zones. Christina, you're a historian, you're really talking about the past, and you're giving us a really difficult, fraught, and flawed history of attempted solidarity, collaboration, cohabitation. And Riley, you were talking in somehow the future imperfect and some kind of aspirational mode that comes closer to reframing. But and where are we in attempts at reframing something that is just in which we're so immersed and flattened really by the realities in which we live? So I was wondering again if I could put you in conversation in relation to this question.
So we'll take two questions since we have two speakers. One other question? Yeah, just one question. And then Jack will come to you after the next round.
Thank you both so much for your comments there. amazingly generative, and there's so much I could say. But one thing I actually was hoping I could ask you both to talk about was I see in both your works, your discussion, is a real kind of foregrounding of thinking about violence beyond this kind of like bloody show of power that I think you're really pointing to here, Riley, in terms of moving away from thinking about the kind of mathematization of death, right? That we're just counting these numbers again and again, and so you're highlighting these kind of maybe more biopolitical or generative forms of violence. At the same time, you're doing this work of uncovering, right, in this kind of like, I think for both of you, thinking about this in a kind of uncovering as a genealogical project, but you also seem both kind of committed to a certain form of opacity, right, a certain form of granting privacy to those for whom privacy has been removed. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tension there, right? In terms of this kind of different historiographic method of uncovering that also is respectful to the right to, and I don't want to actually say right to privacy, but I kind of do mean something like that, a kind of refusal to disclose, I would say.
Great. So we'll take these two questions and then come back.
Could I piggyback on that just? Oh, no. Don't have to.
We'll come back. We'll come back to you. Great. First take.
Okay, so the way that Black on Both Sides begins is with a quote from Fanon that says, "The problem under consideration is time," and you know, what I presented here is certainly playing more in the contemporary than the book does. In many ways, there's the just recurring news cycle about some new legal threat to trans life chances has caused me to keep tweaking what, you know, in another, if I had probably written about something else, I wouldn't have to change the formulation so much. But it becomes an interesting way for me to try to think about dipping across time. And certainly one of the things I'm really interested in, kind of drawing from Fanon to Sylvia Wynter, like what is the temporality of sociogenesis, is sort of the question of the project, but also the question of getting to some horizon that might approximate liberation. At which point I'm also then thinking something along the kind of line of you know, like what does it mean to register as an event? Maybe it already happened when McCarris Grant lived restively and dropped out of the archive. Because what kinds of interpretive frameworks might we have for saying that McCarris Grant chose to do these things and did not come back into visibility, i.e. perhaps did not get rearrested? One of the most striking comments I ever received around the chapter on the 50s, this chapter I wrote about the 50s, was like, oh, it must have been better in the 50s because these people didn't die. And I was like, wow, the assumptions there. But I also, I think that leads into the kind of question about the doing genealogy, uncovering, and also having a commitment to opacity. And I just want to highlight Kara Keeling's essay, Looking for M, and the distinction that Keeling makes around what does it mean to look after versus look for. And so the kind of a sense of resisting certain kinds of scholarly impulses to mark, identify, and demonstrate mastery over what you have found, and rather to think about the figures that inhabit the projects as that you are their caretaker, is something that I am deeply moved by in that particular essay, but then also continue to work, I think, with Keeling and also with Glissant's notion of the right to opacity as kind of the ethical dimensions of my methodological practice.
So I'll just chime in with a couple of things here, which is one to say, I have an interest in social movements and I have an interest in uneven development. And social movements are thus always and or should be about models from the past, but they're always, almost always, oriented towards the future. And so in that way, there's a certain structure that is often presumed for the writing of social movements as only of the past that can't really account often for the form and arguments that social movements take. And when it comes to uneven development, we know that on a global scale, capitalism's mechanisms are cyclical and they reproduce themselves over time and across space. And so again, this is not just about the lessons of the past for the future, but about the fact that things that happen in the future and the past exist in this relation. And I say this less as some kind of like exercise in a temporal spin, as much as to say I think that for the kind of work that I see myself doing in solidarity with Riley is one that really does want to push at the boundaries that academic disciplines have then posed for the proper objects of and the proper methods for understanding the past and or the future. And a lot of these are debates about the terms that social movements themselves are engaging. Agency, actors. Like, do we understand social movements to be driven primarily as sort of individual acts of actors demonstrating acts of agency that transform the social world? Is that about the individual? Is it about the social collective? Is it about other forms? How do we read that? Within the history of LGBT history and LGBT social movements, there often is such historically a fixation on this idea of subjects as these kind of actors who hold these identities that it's very hard to think about structures of racialization, structures of gendering in sort of constituting those histories, about whiteness, not just white LGBT people, but about whiteness within LGBT history. And this is the case about thinking about gender within a new field of transgender history that still can be really to really deal with these questions of gendering in other ways. So I think one of the things that's most important then is this opportunity to read and to engage, even if you don't always come to the same argument. I love evidence. Do you know what I mean? At the same time, I just spew evidence. But I need to read other things in order to think different ways about how knowledge is produced. And so all of the recent awards from the historians that your book has gotten is a very exciting moment. Do you know what I mean? About a different kind of alignment of knowledge. So I just wanted to say, and then the last thing I'll say just about opacity has to do with how we understand identity also, as rather than, we don't have to eschew identity, to not only treat identity as a thing rather than a relation. Okay, and I think when identity is treated as a thingness is often then when a certain kind of total legibility is assumed. But when we understand identity as a relation, and that enacts power in all different ways, to come back to these questions about the legacy of Fierce's leadership, when we think about identity not as a thing but as a relation, then it becomes a very different mobilization. We don't have to dispense with it, but we think of its relationship to power differently. And so that's sort of how I get at those questions around capacity.
Great. So, Jack Halberstam and then Lala Bulugod.
I'll be quick because I'm sure there are other questions, and I just want to thank both of you for these presentations, and just maybe invite you to, picking up on Christina's last point, tell us exactly how you assemble these really different and counterintuitive archives, because in terms of the theme here of reframing transgender violence, it makes so much difference that Riley begins with Marion Sims' experiments on the bodies of black female slaves to tell a history of trans violence, and that Christina goes into the narrative that has become the kind of standard narrative for queer liberation, i.e. we put up a defense against violence, and turned it into the narrative about the normalization of LGBT politics. So in one case, Christina, as she said repeatedly, is using the very narrative of liberation to show us how normalization picks up pace and steam. And on the other hand, Riley is you just completely refuse the archive that you've been given of trans life and create a completely different one, which then forces us to tell different narratives about trans bodies. So I think it would be instructive for all of us to just hear from you, like Riley, how you manage an archive that is not simply about transitivity but fungibility, which is the word that you used. And Christina, what it would mean to tell the history of the left out, who, after all, by being left out, are consigned to illegibility, right? So, method, archive, counterintuitive, not rehearsing the same names over and over again, but actually, the archive is jammed with unknown people. We do not have to rest on the names that, whether it's the hegemonic names we're given, or even the countercultural names, where yes, Sylvia Rivera, but there are a million other names in the archive that we should also either be looking for or refusing names altogether.
Lila?
So interesting that we're obsessing about method, because I think we were invited to, and these are really wonderful papers. And I just got thinking, so anthropology, and ethnography, and I'm a very ambivalent ethnographer at this point, but my entry to, this world, and I love the book, and I can't wait to read yours, but I was on David Valentine's dissertation committee, and he was a student at NYU, and he was riding his bicycle, and he found, what you found, this kind of split and this separation of identities, and people who didn't fit this, and then they get to be that, and it's not about sexuality, or is it about gender? So he was doing that then, and I thought it was very, I don't know what his reputation is within this community, and he doesn't do this anymore, but it was very interesting because it didn't fit, and he told the same political story, I think, that you did on the basis of ethnography, actually knowing people and recognizing that certain people were excluded from the balls, and certain, it was ethnographic. So it wasn't opaque, there's a problem, right? But he actually saw the politics through the lies and described them. So should they have been kept secret, or was that a contribution to notice the change in political landscape and identities and how they didn't fit on the basis of ethnography? So I'm really interested in this. Maybe Jack had a better way of saying, how do we pick our archives? Shall we be opaque? Protect people, yes. And maybe we wouldn't know certain things and be able to track these really problematic politics unless we actually were with the lives themselves. So it's really another invitation to say, really, do we want to be opaque about certain things? I understand it. It's very popular to say that. But I also think, how do we know things? But which things? And who wants to know, and for what purpose? I just would love to hear more, because this is really important work. So, but from my ethnographer, this is something else should do. Really know more?
We could do a question if there's
Or is that
No.
So
We're figuring out if we're supposed to answer that.
so so as someone who also took classes with you, it's really a pleasure to see you. And also my graduate advisor was an anthropologist as well from Columbia, John Jackson. So the ethnography question is quite interesting to me, and in relation to something that I think now that I'm in the discipline of English, I ask my students what contexts matter for you to get what's going on in this narrative, let's say, right? And so for me, the kind of practice of opacity isn't about kind of politics of withholding that is disingenuous to the enterprise of wanting to know something, as so much as it is about like wanting to flag our attention to what we think are the necessary contexts to understand trans life. And so, like, particularly in the 4th chapter, I have a kind of long meditation on all the things that people have become accustomed to in terms of thinking about like how we even mark a trans life as a trans life. Like, we're gonna find out what their like birth name is, or we're gonna find out like, and all of this stuff is staged in media. And I say, and I've gotten some pushback around it, but I'm just like, I'm not interested in providing those contexts, that there are other things that are going on, and perhaps in many ways that reading the articles for what they betray about the value of these folks, even as they're trying to position them in these kind of spectacular forms of othering, is what I think is the kind of necessary things to know about the fact that these folks were living in the 1950s. And to talk about David Valentine's work, I think it's helpful, and I cite it frequently and teach it. But I think there's both that in terms of the approach to the kinds of materials that I'm looking at, which I think differ from certain kinds of ethnographic mandates or strictures. At the same time, I'd say that it is having been trained by ethnographers that I think so much about the context of things. And thinking about the politics of writing up is also how I approach media materials. But thinking about where one inflects, not to just dump every anthropological buzzword out there, right? But to finish that line of thought, but thinking about where's the designation or emphasis in the thick description. The question from Jack about the construction of the archive. So the project really aimed to do like a history of two changing constructs over time. So there's also that ongoing debate going on now, which is like, can you even talk about something like transness before the 1950s, maybe a little earlier. But part of what I was trying to think about through using the language of fungibility and thinking about archives that are associated with plantation economies is like the notion of gender as mutable, as fungible, actually takes place far before we have a kind of a body that is being described in certain kinds of medical discourse as suitable for some form of medical intervention that will produce a differently gendered body. And so the kind of thinking about racial violence as constituting the very idea that a body can change became, I thought, a necessary starting point for thinking then about the very imagination that's opened up by thinking about transness or the possibility of transness. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think I remember both the questions now. Sorry.
Okay.
So I'll start also here to say, I think people have had mixed reactions to David Valentine's book. quite enjoy it myself. I really like it, but I think there have been, within trans studies, mixed experiences of it. I think his current research on outer space actually is aligned with what is most valuable about his book, which is about the creation of transgender as a category. Do you know what I mean? And so in tracing its emergence as a category, which is also the ways in which we think about that which is I think one of the things that's most effective in the book. And as a result, then, I would say what the book doesn't do are these kinds of questions that Riley brought up about, the context that it provides. It's so amazing, and I really think magnificent, is about the context for the emergence of a category that is used to administrate with mostly social services, okay? What it doesn't provide, and does not say that it's going to provide, which I again think is a benefit of the book, is some kind of suggestion that it's providing an alternative look at the interior life worlds of those who are excluded from that category. What he does is he argues there is this category, this is who it includes, this is who it doesn't include. We get a little bit of a sense of what these different sex gender systems are, but the focus is not in actually suggesting that what he's giving us is this clear look at these other worlds. So I think that's both something that it doesn't provide, and that's something that's really effective about the book that it doesn't provide. I think it also does that in the context of social movements. He has a chapter about this very same debate in Greenwich Village, and about I think it's called the calculus of violence. And what he looks at very much there is the landscape of signs and political positions that doesn't give us the thickness of social movements and their debates. That's not a critique of the book at all, because the way in which he maps what's happening in Greenwich Village is exactly on mark. But what it turns out is that for any of us who have been involved in any social movement, we all know that all this material that gets produced and distributed in signs, oh my gosh, if you only read those, you totally misunderstand everything that's going on. Do you know what I mean? We all wince when we think about some flyer we once wrote, or, some statement that was made, or, and that's not actually a revelation of what's happening, because, and this is where, and Lisa Dugan has talked about this a lot around the sort of the ways in which people look at identity politics, and they take these sort of surface terms of identity claims, they're like, oh, they don't talk about class at all. Well, actually, if you look at the campaign they pursued, the campaign is centered economic redistribution very centrally. So I guess that's what we need to do. So that's, I think, part of the way I would engage with that. But I'm a yay on the Valentine book. Well, I do know some other people. Jack, this is something I'm really struggling with is these questions of these social movement archives. My first book was distinctly genealogical. So in the sense that I started and I looked at different moments and I worked my way backwards to find out what were the forms that shaped each subsequent social movement. Here what I'm doing is I'm looking at the landscape of these sort of different discursive forms and then trying to think what happened to the social movements that brought those discursive forms into being, but they may not have actually been in active conversation. So it does involve going with very little knowledge into histories of, right now, pouring through the debates of the attack on Acorn and trying to understand then sort of how things that are not named happened in the history of Acorn. I just finished an essay about needle exchange programs that touched in their relationship with ACT UP. And then how do we understand what doesn't get pulled into ACT UP? How is its other history not captured? And it is, for me, it is a tension between having to look broadly, find things that we don't expect, but my strong desire to find a certain kind of evidence that I don't necessarily want to weight it with the meaning that people often use the word evidence to mean. Do you know what I mean? So, what are those material histories that we might understand in different ways? I hope that answers that a little bit.
This has just been terrific, and we all owe you both a debt of gratitude in pushing the project of rethinking transgender violence, rethinking the relationship between transgender violence and gender violence, and thinking transgender outside the box of violence to then go back and think about transgender violence. So we're going to take a 15-minute coffee, tea, cookie break. But before we do that, I think we all want to acknowledge how grateful we are to have had an opportunity to be sitting in this room listening to this extraordinary conversation. So thank you so much.